February 3, 1945. Santo Tomas Internment Camp, Manila, Philippines. The morning air hung thick with humidity and the scent of overcooked rice. Dust particles danced in shafts of sunlight that pierced through the torn canvas of the camp's makeshift hospital tent. Inside, 77 American military nurses, the Angels of Bataan, stirred from their straw mattresses, their white uniforms now yellowed and patched from 3 years of captivity. The rhythmic clang of mess tins echoed across the compound as Japanese guards prepared the morning roll call. Ko Tanaka, a 23-year-old Japanese civilian nurse captured during the retreat from Luzon, pressed her face against the wooden slats of her barracks window. Her dark eyes followed the familiar procession of American prisoners shuffling toward the yard, their movements mechanical after months of routine. She had grown accustomed to the sight of the American nurses, women who worked tirelessly despite their circumstances, yet always under the watchful command of male guards and Japanese officers. In her world, this was natural order. Women served, men commanded. The hierarchy was as fixed as the sunrise. Then the gates creaked open. Through the entrance marched a small detail of American soldiers, their boots striking the packed earth with crisp precision. At first glance, nothing seemed extraordinary. Pressed uniforms, polished belts, rifles held at attention. But as Ko's eyes focused, her breath caught in her throat. The soldiers were women. Their hair was pinned neatly beneath regulation caps. Their jackets bore the insignia of rank. And most shocking of all, they walked with the unmistakable bearing of command. The lead figure, a tall woman with sharp eyes and confident stride, carried a clipboard against her chest like a shield of authority. The way she held it, the casual yet purposeful manner in which she flipped through its pages, spoke of power that Ko had never witnessed in female hands. This was no nurse's gentle notepad or clerk's timid ledger. This was the instrument of command. Ko's hands trembled as she gripped the window frame. Around her, other Japanese prisoners pressed forward, their whispers sharp with disbelief. "Ana no gunjin," someone breathed. "Women soldiers." The words felt like blasphemy on their tongues. The liberation of the Philippines in early 1945 marked more than just the end of Japanese occupation. It represented a collision between two radically different philosophies of warfare and society. While Imperial Japan had mobilized its women as factory workers and agricultural laborers, keeping them firmly within traditional support roles, the United States had taken an unprecedented step, arming women with authority itself. By 1945, over 150,000 American women served in the Women's Army Corps, with thousands more in the Navy Waves, the Coast Guard Spars, and the Women Air Force Service pilots. These were not auxiliary helpers or medical volunteers. They were soldiers with ranks, responsibilities, and most revolutionary of all, the power to command men. When liberation forces arrived in the Philippines, they brought with them female officers whose very presence would shatter the worldview of every Japanese prisoner who witnessed them. The contrast was devastating in its clarity. Japan's national mobilization law had conscripted women into supporting roles while maintaining absolute male dominance in military hierarchy. Even female nurses, the most respected women in wartime Japan, operated under strict male supervision. No Japanese woman could issue orders to men, carry weapons of authority, or make decisions that affected military operations. To do so would be to violate centuries of social order and imperial tradition. America's approach was different entirely. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself had declared that the Allies could not have won the war without women soldiers. In American camps, hospitals, and administrative centers across the Pacific, women lieutenants commanded male sergeants, female captains directed male enlisted personnel, and WAC officers made life and death decisions with the same authority as their male counterparts. The clipboard had become their scepter, and men saluted when they saw it. The Great Expectation versus Reality. For the Japanese prisoners witnessing liberation, the shock ran deeper than military defeat. They had expected American brutality, perhaps even expected American abundance. But they had not expected American women to embody power itself. Aiko Yamamoto, a 26-year-old teacher from Osaka who had been pressed into service as a communications clerk before capture, later wrote in her secret diary, "We were prepared to see conquerors. We were prepared to see wealth. We were not prepared to see their women wearing the faces of generals." The Japanese military had spent years conditioning its people to believe that women's battlefield was the home, that their strength lay in silent endurance, and that their highest calling was supporting men who made the real decisions. Radio broadcasts throughout the war had thundered with announcements praising eternal womanly virtues, obedience, silence, and service. The sight of an American female lieutenant adjusting her cap while reviewing prisoner lists challenged every assumption about natural order that these women had absorbed since childhood. Major Charity Adams, the highest-ranking African-American woman in the Women's Army Corps and commander of the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, encountered this cultural shock firsthand when her unit processed mail for prisoners of war. In her memoirs, One Woman's Army, she recalled the stunned expressions of Japanese female prisoners when they saw her reviewing their correspondence with the clipboard of command authority. They stared as if witnessing magic, not the magic of power, but the magic of impossibility made real. The women expected American military efficiency. They expected American technological superiority. They did not expect American women to be the ones delivering both with the casual confidence of those born to command. The statistical reality behind what the prisoners witnessed was staggering. While Japan had mobilized fewer than 10,000 women in any formal military capacity during the entire war, nearly all as nurses operating. Under male authority, the United States had created an entirely parallel command structure staffed by women. The Women's Army Corps alone had grown to encompass roles that would have been unthinkable in Japanese society. WWII officers served as cryptographers, decoding enemy messages that could determine the fate of entire battles. They worked as air traffic controllers, directing the movement of bombers that would deliver devastating payloads to Japanese cities. They commanded transportation units, managed supply chains that stretched across oceans, and made strategic decisions that affected millions of lives. Documentation from the International Committee of the Red Cross, filed in neutral language in Geneva archives, recorded the reaction of Japanese female prisoners with clinical precision. Female POWs expressed marked surprise at observational roles of American women soldiers. Guard units observed to include female WWII officers exercising command authority over male personnel. No incidents of insubordination noted. Beneath that sterile, bureaucratic language lay a human earthquake. In one surviving diary, smuggled out of Santo Tomas years later, a prisoner named Yuki Hasegawa wrote, "Today I saw a woman with bars on her collar tell men where to stand, and they obeyed her as naturally as breathing. My grandmother taught me that such a sight would bring the wrath of heaven. Instead, it brought liberation." The contrast in numbers alone told a story of two civilizations approaching warfare from fundamentally different assumptions. America's 86,000 WWII personnel outnumbered the entire female military service of Japan by nearly 9-1. The 57,000 women in the Army Nurse Corps represented more medical authority in female hands than existed in all of Asia. When General MacArthur's forces landed in the Philippines, they brought with them a revolution disguised as standard operating procedure. Lieutenant Colonel Ruth Streeter, director of the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, kept detailed records that illustrated the scope of this transformation. Her reports, preserved in the National Archives, document women commanding anti-aircraft batteries, managing intelligence operations, and serving as combat correspondents with the authority to interview generals and influence public perception of the war. Each clipboard carried more power than any Japanese woman had been permitted to wield in the entire history of the empire. The statistical reality behind what the prisoners witnessed was staggering. While Japan had mobilized fewer than 10,000 women in any formal military capacity during the entire war, nearly all as nurses operating under male authority, the United States had created an entirely parallel command structure staffed by women. The Women's Army Corps alone had grown to encompass roles that would have been unthinkable in Japanese society. WAC officers served as cryptographers, decoding enemy messages that could determine the fate of entire battles. They worked as air traffic controllers, directing the movement of bombers that would deliver devastating payloads to Japanese cities. They commanded transportation units, managed supply chains that stretched across oceans, and made strategic decisions that affected millions of lives. Documentation from the International Committee of the Red Cross, filed in neutral language in Geneva archives, recorded the reaction of Japanese female prisoners with clinical precision. Female POWs expressed marked surprise at observational roles of American women soldiers. Guard units observed to include female WWII officers exercising command authority over male personnel. No incidents of insubordination noted. Beneath that sterile bureaucratic language lay a human earthquake. In one surviving diary, smuggled out, of Santo Tomas years later, a prisoner named Yuki Hasegawa wrote, "Today, I saw a woman with bars on her collar tell men where to stand, and they obeyed her as naturally as breathing. My grandmother taught me that such a sight would bring the wrath of heaven. Instead, it brought liberation." The contrast in numbers alone told a story of two civilizations approaching warfare from fundamentally different assumptions. America's 86,000 WAVs personnel outnumbered the entire female military service of Japan by nearly 9-1. The 57,000 women in the Army Nurse Corps represented more medical authority in female hands than existed in all of Asia. When General MacArthur's forces landed in the Philippines, they brought with them a revolution disguised as standard operating procedure. Lieutenant Colonel Ruth Streeter, director of the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, kept detailed records that illustrated the scope of this transformation. Her reports, preserved in the National Archives, document women commanding anti-aircraft batteries, managing intelligence operations, and serving as combat correspondents with the authority to interview generals and influence public perception of the war. Each clipboard carried more power than any Japanese woman had been permitted to wield in the entire history of the empire. The psychological impact of witnessing American women in command created fractures that would never fully heal. For prisoners, like Ko Tanaka, the sight of female officers reviewing their cases with clipboards of authority represented more than military efficiency. It represented the collapse of certainty itself. "I had been taught that nature itself demanded male leadership," Ko would later tell American occupation officials during post-war interviews. "When I saw your women giving orders that men followed without shame, I understood that we had lost more than territory. We had lost our understanding of what was possible." The transformation was not immediate, nor was it uniform. Some Japanese prisoners rejected what they saw as an aberration, a temporary inversion of natural order that would surely be corrected once the Americans returned home. Others experienced what psychologists would later term cognitive dissonance, the painful mental adjustment required when core beliefs collide with undeniable reality. But for many, the sight of American women wielding clipboards with the same authority as swords began a profound reassessment of everything they had been taught about gender, power, and society itself. Tomiko Sato, a young woman from Yokosuka who had worked in naval communications before capture, later wrote, "The first time I saw an American woman lieutenant checking names on her list while men saluted her, I felt the world tilt sideways. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right in a way we had never been allowed to imagine. This transformation extended beyond individual prisoners to influence post-war Japanese society itself. Many of the women who witnessed American female authority during liberation would later become advocates for women's rights in occupied Japan. They had seen the impossible made routine, and that vision could not be erased by repatriation or cultural pressure. The evidence suggests that American women's military service during World War II, did more than contribute to Allied victory. It created a psychological weapon that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Axis societies about human potential and social organization. In the hands of American women officers, the humble clipboard became more than an administrative tool. It became a symbol of revolutionary change. Every list checked, every name recorded, every order transcribed represented a defiance of centuries of assumed limitations. When Major Adams stood before Japanese prisoners with her clipboard, reviewing their mail distribution, she embodied more than military efficiency. She represented a society that had decided women could be trusted with life-and-death decisions, that their judgment was equal to men's, and that their authority deserved the same respect accorded to any officer. The clipboard was democratic in its simplicity. Unlike swords or rifles, which spoke of violence and conquest, the clipboard represented organization, planning, and the methodical application of rational authority. It was a tool of civilization, rather than destruction, and seeing it wielded by women suggested that American strength came not from brute force alone, but from the efficient mobilization of all human resources. For Japanese observers, this was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of American female authority. They could understand women forced into desperate measures by extraordinary circumstances. They could comprehend women fighting for survival or defending their children, but they struggled to process women calmly exercising administrative power with the casual confidence of those who had never been told such authority was beyond their reach. Lieutenant Mary Louise Roberts of the Women's Army Corps, who processed prisoner exchanges in the Philippines, kept detailed notes on the reactions she observed. "The Japanese women watched me work," she wrote, "not with hostility, but with the fascination of children seeing their first airplane. They understood the function, but not the possibility." Each notation on her clipboard represented a small act of revolution. A woman making decisions that affected human lives. A woman exercising judgment that men would accept without question. A woman wielding power as naturally as breathing. In aggregate, these small acts constituted a transformation of human possibility that would echo long after the war's end. The impact of witnessing American women in command extended far beyond the prison camps of the Philippines. As word spread, through prisoner networks, stories of female officers with clipboards became legend, myth, and eventually inspiration. In post-war interviews conducted by occupation authorities, Japanese women repeatedly returned to the image of American female officers calmly exercising authority. "They held their papers like weapons," recalled one former prisoner, "but weapons that created order instead of destroying it." The psychological aftermath was profound. Women who had spent their entire lives accepting male dominance as natural law found themselves questioning assumptions that had never before been examined. If American women could command men effectively, if they could make crucial decisions under pressure, if they could earn respect through competence rather than submission, then what did that say about the limitations Japanese society had placed on half its population? Some historians argue that the sight of American women wielding clipboards of authority contributed more to Japan's post-war democratization than any written constitution or legal reform. Laws could be imposed by occupation forces, but the image of female competence in action had to be internalized by those who witnessed it. The evidence supports this interpretation. Many Japanese women who encountered female American officers during liberation later became leaders in Japan's women's rights movement. They had seen a different way of organizing society, and that vision became a catalyst for change that would transform Japan over the following decades. Perhaps the most devastating realization for Japanese prisoners was numerical. While they had fought with half their population silenced and sidelined, America had mobilized women as full partners in the war effort. The mathematics of defeat became clear when expressed in terms of wasted human potential. Major Adams captured this reality in her observation of prisoner processing. They calculated our numbers with the desperation of generals counting enemy divisions. 150,000 women in the WWII alone, another 86,000 waves, tens of thousands more in specialized roles. They were doing arithmetic that should have been done in Tokyo years earlier. The clipboard in Adams's hands represented more than administrative efficiency. It represented the mobilization of American women's intellectual capacity for strategic purposes. While Japanese women had been relegated to producing bullets and growing rice, American women had been producing intelligence, managing logistics, and making command decisions that directly influenced military outcomes. For Ko Tanaka, watching Adams review prisoner lists with calm professionalism, the implications were staggering. "I realized we had fought a war with one hand tied behind our backs," she later wrote, "while our enemies fought with both hands free. The defeat was mathematical before it was military." This realization went beyond simple gender equality to touch fundamental questions about resource allocation and social efficiency. A society that prevented women from contributing their full capabilities was handicapping itself in competition with societies that had learned to harness all available talent. The clipboard became a symbol of this efficient resource utilization. Every task performed by American women officers was a task that freed American men for combat roles. Every decision made by female administrators was a decision that didn't require pulling male officers from fighting positions. The multiplication effect was overwhelming when calculated across the entire war effort. The conversations among Japanese prisoners, recorded in diaries and recalled in post-war interviews, revealed the profound psychological impact of witnessing American women in command positions. "We discussed it every night," remembered Aiko Yamamoto. Some women insisted it was humiliation, that the Americans were flaunting their women before us to demonstrate our weakness. Others argued it was revelation, that we were seeing what women could become when not constrained by artificial limitations. The debates were fierce and emotional. Traditional Japanese values clashed with observed reality in ways that sometimes led to anger, sometimes to tears, and sometimes to a kind of wondering silence that spoke of worldviews cracking under pressure. "I watched an American woman lieutenant review our medical records," recalled Yuki Hasegawa. "She made notes, asked questions, gave orders to male medics. The men obeyed her without hesitation or embarrassment. I realized that in their world, competence mattered more than gender. It was a revolutionary concept." These conversations continued long after liberation, as repatriated prisoners struggled to reconcile what they had witnessed with the society they found upon returning to Japan. Many reported feeling like strangers in their own country, carrying visions of possibility that seemed impossible to explain to those who had not seen American women wielding clipboards with the authority of command. The psychological transformation was often painful. Women who had accepted their limited roles as natural suddenly found themselves questioning everything they had been taught about their own capabilities. The sight of American female officers had planted seeds of possibility that would grow throughout their lives. The Liberation Moment, February 23, 1945. The gates of Santo Tomas finally opened not to guards or administrators, but to freedom itself. American forces had fought their way through Manila's ruins to reach the camp, and among the liberating soldiers were women officers whose presence completed the revolution in consciousness. that had begun with that first glimpse of female authority. Major Charity. Adams stood in the camp's central yard, clipboard in hand, coordinating the massive logistical operation required to process thousands of liberated prisoners. Around her, male officers waited for her orders. Medics organized supplies according to her directions, and transportation units prepared for deployment based on her strategic decisions. For Ko Tanaka, watching from the crowd of liberated prisoners, the moment crystallized everything she had learned about American society during her captivity. She stood there like a general surveying a battlefield, Ko would later write, except her battlefield was human suffering, and her weapon was organized compassion. The clipboard in Adams' hands now represented more than administrative efficiency. It represented the systematic application of female competence to the monumental task of reconstruction. Every name checked, every resource allocated, every decision recorded demonstrated that women could manage crises as effectively as any man. The contrast with Japanese women's wartime roles was impossible to ignore. While they had been trained to endure suffering silently, American women had been trained to alleviate it systematically. While they had been taught to accept their fate passively, American women had been taught to take control of circumstances and reshape them according to rational plans. The symbolic power of paper in the immediate aftermath of liberation, as American women officers moved through the camps with their clipboards, processing the complex paperwork required to return thousands of prisoners to civilian life. The symbolic power of those simple paper-holding devices became overwhelming. Each clipboard represented choice, the choice to organize rather than simply endure, to plan rather than merely react, to take responsibility rather than wait for others to decide. For Japanese women who had been conditioned to see such choices as beyond their proper sphere, witnessing American women making thousands of crucial decisions with calm competence was transformative. Lieutenant Sarah Chen of the Women's Army Corps, whose parents had immigrated from China, found herself processing the cases of Japanese women who had never seen an Asian woman in a position of authority. They studied my clipboard as if it were a sacred text, she later recalled. I think they were trying to understand how the same hands that could birth children could also manage military logistics. The irony was profound. Instruments of bureaucracy had become symbols of liberation. The very administrative tools that prisoners had learned to fear in Japanese hands. The lists, the forms, the systematic record-keeping now represented hope when wielded by American women officers. This symbolic transformation reflected a deeper truth about the nature of power and its proper use. In Japanese hands, bureaucratic authority had meant oppression and arbitrary control. In American women's hands, it meant rational organization applied to humanitarian purposes. The sight of American women commanding with clipboards created psychological ripples that extended far beyond the liberation camps. As stories spread through Japan's surrendering military and civilian population, the image of female authority became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Japanese strategic thinking. We had assumed American decadence, wrote Colonel Takeshi Yamashita in his post-war memoirs. We interpreted their willingness to put women in uniform as evidence of desperation and weakness. We failed to understand that it represented the mobilization of human resources we had left untapped. This misunderstanding had strategic consequences that went beyond simple numerical disadvantage. American women's participation in the war effort had freed American men for combat roles while providing the military with a pool of talent that proved exceptionally capable in technical and administrative positions. The clipboard, in this context, represented more than female empowerment. It represented rational resource allocation. Every task performed efficiently by American women officers was a task that didn't require deploying male personnel away from combat positions. The multiplication effect across the entire war effort was staggering. Major Adams, reflecting on her experience in post-war interviews, observed, We didn't set out to challenge assumptions about gender. We set out to win a war. But in mobilizing women effectively, America gained an advantage that our enemies never understood until it was too late. The ripple effects of revolution, the sight of American women commanding with clipboards, created psychological ripples that extended far beyond the liberation camps. As stories spread through Japan's surrendering military and civilian population, the image of female authority became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Japanese strategic thinking. "We had assumed American decadence," wrote Colonel Takeshi Yamashita in his post-war memoirs. "We interpreted their willingness to put women in uniform as evidence of desperation and weakness. We failed to understand that it represented the mobilization of human resources we had left untapped. This misunderstanding had strategic consequences that went beyond simple numerical disadvantage. American women's participation in the war effort had freed American men for combat roles while providing the military with a pool of talent that proved exceptionally capable in technical and administrative positions. The clipboard, in this context, represented more than female empowerment. It represented rational resource allocation. Every task performed efficiently by American women officers was a task that didn't require deploying male personnel away from combat positions. The multiplication effect across the entire war effort was staggering. Major Adams, reflecting on her experience in post-war interviews, observed, "We didn't set out to challenge assumptions about gender. We set out to win a war. But in mobilizing women effectively, America gained an advantage that our enemies never understood until it was too late." For Japanese women prisoners, the psychological journey from shock to understanding to acceptance was often painful and always profound. The sight of American women wielding clipboards with casual authority had shattered assumptions that many had never consciously examined. "I returned to Japan, carrying questions I could not answer," wrote Kotanaka in her private diary. If American women could command men successfully, why had we been taught it was impossible? If they could make crucial decisions under pressure, why had we been trained only to endure pressure passively? These questions had no easy answers within the framework of traditional Japanese society. Many women who had witnessed American female authority during liberation found themselves caught between two worldviews: the traditional system they had been raised in and the revolutionary possibility they had observed in action. The transformation was not simply intellectual, but deeply emotional. Women who had spent their entire lives accepting limitations as natural found themselves mourning opportunities they had never imagined could exist. The clipboard became a symbol of roads not taken, potential unrealized, and voices that had been silenced before they could speak. Some adapted by becoming advocates for change within Japan's post-war reconstruction. Others struggled with lifelong feelings of loss and regret. But virtually all carried the image of American women commanding with clipboards as evidence that human society could be organized differently, more efficiently, and more justly. What prisoners witnessed in those liberation camps was more than military efficiency. It was a revolution in how human societies could organize themselves. The clipboard in American women's hands represented the systematic application of female intelligence to practical problems, and the results spoke for themselves. The speed and effectiveness with which American women officers processed thousands of prisoners, organized medical care, coordinated transportation, and managed the complex logistics of liberation demonstrated capabilities that Japanese society had never allowed women to develop or display. Lieutenant Mary Roberts, reviewing her wartime service decades later, observed, "We proved that competence has no gender. Every list I checked, every order I gave, every decision I made contributed to demonstrating that women could handle responsibility as effectively as men." The clipboard was our proof of capability. This proof was especially powerful because it was demonstrated rather than merely argued. Japanese prisoners didn't hear lectures about gender equality. They witnessed it in action. They saw American women making life-and-death decisions with calm professionalism, managing complex operations with systematic efficiency, and earning respect through demonstrated competence. The visual impact was overwhelming. Every time an American woman officer consulted her clipboard and issued orders that men followed without hesitation, she was conducting a practical demonstration of principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. The economics of liberation. The liberation camps became laboratories for demonstrating the economic advantages of mobilizing women's capabilities. American women officers didn't simply process prisoners. They did so with an efficiency that impressed even their male counterparts. Major Adams's unit, the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, had processed mail faster than any comparable male unit, handling over 17 million pieces of correspondence while maintaining accuracy rates that exceeded military standards. When applied to prisoner processing, these same organizational capabilities proved invaluable. The women were systematic in ways that saved both time and resources, observed Captain James Mitchell, a male officer who worked alongside WWII personnel during liberation operations. They approached every task with a methodical efficiency that eliminated waste and reduced errors. The clipboard, in this context, represented more than authority. It represented the systematic application of organizational intelligence to practical problems. Every notation made, every list completed, every process streamlined demonstrated the economic value of utilizing women's capabilities fully. For Japanese observers, this efficiency was particularly striking because it contrasted sharply with their own experience of bureaucratic inefficiency and administrative chaos during the war's final months. American women officers appeared to accomplish more with clipboards and systematic planning than Japanese administrators had achieved with elaborate hierarchies and rigid protocols. In the years following Japan's surrender, as the country struggled to rebuild from the ashes of defeat, the memory of American women wielding clipboards with calm authority became a touchstone for those advocating social change. The image had burned itself into the consciousness of everyone who witnessed it, becoming a symbol of possibilities that transcended cultural boundaries and historical limitations. Ko Tanaka, who became a teacher in post-war Japan, kept a clipboard on her desk throughout her career, not because she needed it for administrative purposes, but because it reminded her of the day she learned that women could command with competence and dignity. "Every time I looked at it," she wrote in her final diary entry, "I remembered that human potential is not limited by tradition, but only by our willingness to recognize and develop it." The revolution that began with the sight of American women officers reviewing prisoner lists had echoed through decades of social change. The clipboard had become more than a tool. It had become a symbol of the systematic application of human intelligence to the problems of organizing society more justly and efficiently. Historians studying the transformation of Japanese society in the post-war period consistently note the influence of those who had witnessed American women in positions of authority during the occupation. The memory of female officers calmly exercising command had planted seeds of possibility that grew into movements for educational reform, workplace equality, and political participation. The ultimate irony was that America's most powerful weapon in transforming enemy societies was not the atomic bomb or military occupation, but the simple demonstration that women could wield authority with the same competence as men. The clipboard, in skilled female hands, had proven more revolutionary than any ideology. In the end, the most profound victory was not territorial or strategic, but conceptual. American women with clipboards had demonstrated that human societies could organize themselves according to principles of competence rather than tradition, efficiency rather than hierarchy, and possibility rather than limitation. They had shown that freedom was not just the absence of oppression, but the presence of opportunity. And that opportunity knew no gender. The echo of those clipboards still resonates today. In every classroom where women teach with authority, every office where women lead with competence, and every institution where capability matters more than convention, the revolution that began in the liberation camps of 1945 continues, one systematic decision at a time, one organized effort at a time, one clipboard at a time.